Patrick, you're up.
Okay. All right. Okay, I don't have any pictures. And normally, I do have a presentation, but it has lots of equations and numbers and other such things. I figured it's probably not appropriate for this audience. I was asked to speak on the economics of reparations and the freedom budget. And I'd like to comment on both, but to do so within the context of a much broader discussion. The economics of reparations is a pretty straightforward proposition. The federal government and perhaps several state governments make substantial financial payments to African Americans to compensate for slavery, involuntary servitude after slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, police deaths, and continuing discrimination in the market and other social activities. This is a wealth transfer to compensate for racial economic exploitation and racial political oppression. Reparations discussions tend to be an uncomfortable subject to discuss, both for the political right and for the political left. Reparations discussions raise the issue of persistent racism, and it also suggests a race-specific approach to redistributing wealth. The question that it sort of raises to the forefront is, what is it about our economic system? What is it about our economic system that allows racism to be continuously reproduced? The economics of the freedom budget is also simple. Use the power of the federal government's budget to redistribute income and create jobs. The goal of the freedom budget was to eliminate poverty in 10 years, a doable goal. This is a class-specific goal, but it also raises the issue of persistent poverty and the question of what is it about our economic system that allows poverty to be continuously reproduced. Right now, this fiscal year, the federal government's budget is about $3.9 trillion. That's a lot of money. In the next fiscal year, it will rise to $4.01 trillion. That's bigger than the national income of a lot of countries. Randolph and Rustin, in their summary of the freedom budget, said, the federal government will use its spending power and regulatory authority to create full employment for all persons willing and able to work, decent and adequate wages to all workers, decent living standards for those who cannot or should not work, wipe out slum ghettos and provide decent housing to all, to provide decent medical care and adequate educational opportunities at all Americans at an affordable cost, to purify air and water and develop transportation and natural resources on a scale suitable to national needs, to unify full employment with sustained production and high economic growth. That's a bold plan. Now, reparations or any other program that seeks to boldly address persistent racism, and the freedom budget or any other program that seeks to boldly address class inequality must address at least 4 issues. 1, the narrative context by which these issues are discussed. 2, the racial composition of the policymakers. 3, the nature of anti-discrimination policy. And 4, the focus on economic outcomes. So let me first talk about the narrative context of public policy discussions. The currently dominant media and public policy narrative minimizes the role of competitive market forces in reproducing racism, joblessness, and income and wealth inequality. Instead, the dominant narrative individualizes these issues and presents competitive capitalist markets as creating a level playing field for all individuals. So from that perspective, Joblessness exists because individuals are unwilling to work at a wage equal to their productive ability. Income inequality exists because some individuals are willing to work harder, faster, or smarter than others, and because individuals have differences in skill. Racial inequality exists, but not racism from that perspective, because on average, African Americans are less skilled than whites, which sort of raises the question, well, why is that? Well, from the dominant perspective, African Americans are less skilled because of differences in ability or differences in family structure and functioning, differences in individual values and behavior. Then why do wealth differences exist? Because of differences in individual differences in luck or savings behavior or income or risk-taking. Mostly this is nonsense. Okay. The Freedom Budget recognized that joblessness is the cause of poverty. This perspective needs to be expanded into a major explanation of how the economy operates. Some very simple and straightforward questions. Can the economy provide a job to every individual willing and able to work? No. Well, if that's true, then regardless of education or family structure, values and behaviors, etc., some individuals will be jobless unless the government steps in to guarantee a job to everyone willing and able to work. Another question, are wages and employment allocated on the basis, solely on the basis of productive merit? Does the market create a level playing field? No and no. So it's entirely possible for individuals with more or less identical skills and work habits to have unequal access to employment and income. Social identity, in particular race, matters as a social and economic mechanism for determining access to income and employment. Persistent racism will occur unless there is a continuous and aggressive policy to eliminate it. Does the market guarantee that workers and managers will have equal power in the labor market? No. Wealth creates differential opportunities and differential power. Wealth transfers inequality and privilege across time, across space, and across generations. I mean, what does slavery and Jim Crow do? It created a massive wealth transfer from African Americans to whites. And since that wealth transfer occurred and is transferred across generations, it's still with us. Right? Competitive markets reproduce wealth inequality on an expanded scale. We also need to look at the racial composition of policymakers. African Americans are not white people with dark skin. Right? All workers and managers within public and private bureaucracies have a greater and lesser degree of discretion in performing their jobs. Favorable or unfavorable utilization of that discretion varies according to the racial identity match of the bureaucratic agent and the citizenry being served. One of the things I do research on is racial profiling or bias policing. I've spent a lot of time looking at the Florida Highway Patrol, the state police. There's a common set of recruitment criteria. Everybody in the Florida Highway Patrol is trained at exactly the same place. There's a common command structure. There's a common policing manual. Right? And yet, despite that, the policing process varies by race of the officer of the Highway Patrol. White patrol officers are more likely to search drivers, regardless of the race of the driver, than any other group. African Americans are least likely to search stop drivers than anybody else, and Hispanics are in the middle. Right? So policing varies by the race, even though they all have exactly the same training, the same command structure, same recruitment principles, had to pass the same test and everything. Race matters in how they police. It also matters in the terms of the context of the racial identity of the officer and the match with the racial identity of the driver. It also matters in terms of the racial composition of the troop where the officers are assigned. If you move a white officer from a predominantly white troop to a minority troop, that officer will tend to search less. On the other hand, if you move an officer from a predominantly minority troop to a predominantly white troop, they will tend to search more. So the racial composition of the troop matters, the racial identity of the officer matters, and the racial match between the officer and the driver. So race matters in terms of how bureaucracies are run, in terms of the use of discretion. Enacting the freedom budget and reparations or any other program for distributing wealth must go hand in hand with changing the racial composition of the national political leadership and the leadership structures of state government. Right? Voting rights must be preserved and expanded, and racialized gerrymandering has to be eliminated. Another issue that has to be addressed is aggressive, innovative, and I would say highly punitive anti-discrimination policy with respect to racial discrimination. I'm not a lawyer. Wanted to be one, but got sidetracked into a PhD in economics. And just never went back. All right. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says it prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. What if institutions that did discriminate were cut off from federal funding? If you are a sports fan, then you probably noticed that my institution had a big discussion the past year. An accusation was made against the star quarterback, and a lot of people were upset. But the upshot of it was that the university was at risk of having its federal funding cut off because of a Title IX violation of the treatment of women and rape accusations on campus. In turn, that made the university look at every single thing that it was doing regarding gender issues. Well, what if money was cut off to universities that did not hire African Americans or federal contractors that did not hire them? We could use social science research to locate the institutions. It wouldn't be that hard. In the entire history of the state of Florida, there have been precisely 5 African American economists hired in economic departments at predominantly white universities. 5 in the whole history of the state. I think if somebody threatened to cut their money off, they might start hiring more. Right? We also need to focus on economic outcomes. Right? The dominant narrative specifically states that we should focus on equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes. Well, that's incorrect. It presumes a completely false trade-off. We must examine both equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes. Unequal outcomes provide a potential signal of unequal opportunities. So if we go back over the economic history dealing with African Americans and look at something specifically such as employment, it's not enough to say that we have to have an economic policy that pushes the economy towards full employment. Instead, it has to be a little bit more nuanced. We must have 3 to 4% unemployment for all major social groups. For most of the last 45 years, if you were to look at African American male unemployment, individuals 16 to 64, that unemployment rate has hovered around 10 to 15%, reaching a low of 7.3% in 2000 and a high of 21% in 1982. So that's how Bill Clinton became like an honorary black man. He got unemployment down to 7.3%. In other words, we went from a kind of quasi-permanent depression to a very, very high recession level unemployment, and he was great. Well, probably not. All right. Income differences. If you compare African American to white family wages, that ratio during the period 1964, 1972, like right after the end of Jim Crow or about when Jim Crow was ending, depending on when you pick for the end, that ratio was about 57% if you look at the median. For the most recent time period, that ratio was about 59%. Right? In other words, African Americans today families have about 59% on the dollar for white families, and in the late 60s, early 70s, it was 57%. It's a little better if you look at the mean instead of the median, different way of averaging. It was 63% then and 63% now. In fact, most of the progress, and I put that in quotes, that has taken place has actually been in the South. If you look at family income differences by race outside the South, the average has actually gone down. It doesn't make any difference which average you look at. Outside the South, the ratio was about 70 cents on the dollar at the end of Jim Crow. Today it's 58 cents. It's actually in the South where progress was made, moving from a ratio of about 53% to 64%. So with African Americans, over half the population lives in the South. Sometimes there's something that only takes place in the South, and it appears as a national trend just because the overwhelming majority of African Americans live in the South. If you look at poverty rates, again, among African Americans, for the poverty rate outside the South, 1964, 72, it was 20%. Today it's about 23%. The poverty rate went down in the South from 37% to 22% among African Americans. Of course, that's still 2.5 times the white poverty rate. All right. So, yeah, you can defeat poverty, and there was war made in the war on poverty, but not nearly enough because the war wasn't fought long enough. I mean, if you look at other indicators like the employment to population ratio, that's the fraction of the people in a group who actually are working. Among African American men in the mid-60s, the early 70s, about every 4 out of 100 had a job. Today, that's about 63 out of 100. That's a huge problem. If you do not have a job, then you are not marriage material, for example. Right? Because, you show up at home and question that people ask after the guy leaves, that boy got a job. I got 2 daughters, that's the question I ask. Yeah. Got to have some finance to have romance. Right? But so it creates problems for family structure, family functioning. It creates immense problems. Right? The employment ratio increased among women, but that peaked in the 1990s. It increased for African American women from about 54 out of 100 to 64 out of 100, and it really hasn't changed much since then. It's been kind of stagnant. If you look at other indicators, for example, progress in fighting racial discrimination. In the mid-1960s, the early 1970s, if you look at the weekly wages of men, African American men had 63 cents on a dollar relative to white men. That increased to 70% in the 70s, and it's gone down since that time to about 66 cents on a dollar. Well, now that raises an interesting question. Because if you look at years of education or the quality of education as measured by test scores, that gap has been declining quite noticeably. So if the education gap or the skills gap is getting smaller, why is it that there hasn't been similar progress in the wage gap? Again, what is it about the American economy that tends to reproduce persistent racism? Even if you wanted to call that progress, which is not progress, since actually the ratio is the same place it was, only barely 3 percentage points higher than the mid-60s. What is it that makes it so slow? Today, a third of all black families have zero or negative net worth. That means you broke, technically, bankrupt. I was looking at a report from the Center for Responsible Lending. Typical mortgage requires a 20% down payment. And this is a quote from an article. It says, a 20% or even a 10% down payment is likely to make home ownership especially difficult, especially for families with low and middle wealth or income, including many young families and families of color. The Center for Responsible Lending estimates that based on median incomes, it will take nearly 25 years for a typical Hispanic household to save for a 10% down payment, and nearly 30 years for a typical African American household. That's to save for 10% down. Well, if it takes you 30 years to get there, you kind of give a few years to wild and riotous living in the 20s, and then you settle down, you take 30 years to save, you probably aren't going to get there. So that issue needs to be addressed. And we need to focus on these differences in outcomes by social groups in order to get a handle on how the economy operates and to change the entire narrative about how the economy operates and what we can do to change things. Thank you.